You kneel, you pray, you raise your hands toward the heavens, whispering words that sound holy, but deep inside, something feels off. There's a restlessness, a hunger, not for the divine, but for validation. You don't realize it yet, but what you've called faith may have become a mirror, not a window to God, but a reflection of yourself. This is the hidden side of spiritual life that no one dares to talk about. And Freud, yes, the very Freud you thought had nothing to say about God, warned us about it in a way most believers still refuse to accept. Before we go deeper, ask yourself something. When you pray, who are you really speaking to? Is it a divine presence you seek? Or are you just echoing your own voice in the hope that it sounds sacred enough to be believed by others, or worse, by yourself? Sigmund Freud, though often misunderstood, was not simply dismissive of religion. His insights into the unconscious reveal something far more disturbing, that our spiritual expressions can be contaminated by the ego, masked, polished, even sanctified, but still deeply rooted in self-love. In his works like The Future of an Illusion, Freud explains how religious beliefs can act as projections of unfulfilled human desires for protection, love, power, certainty. These desires are not always evil, but when they become the center of our spiritual experience, we are no longer worshiping the divine. We're worshiping our own psychological need. And this is where narcissism enters, quietly, secretly, but completely. Not as vanity in the typical sense, but as a structure of the soul where everything, even God, exists to serve you. Many spiritual seekers fall into this trap without even knowing it. You post a Bible verse on social media, not to spread truth, but to be seen. You talk about your journey with God, not to grow, but to be admired for your depth. You speak of humility and feel proud of how humble you are. It's a dangerous paradox. The more spiritual you appear, the more the narcissistic ego thrives, because now it wears a halo. And no one questions a halo. Freud would have seen this as a defense mechanism, a way of managing anxiety by transforming weakness into spiritual authority. You feel small, lost, or broken, but rather than confront the chaos within, you create a persona of spiritual strength. You claim to have found peace, but what you've really built is a mask, and behind it, the child still cries out for attention, approval, and control. Let's take a real example. Consider the person who constantly testifies about their suffering. I went through so much, and God brought me out. It sounds noble, but if you look closer, sometimes what they're really saying is, look how special I am. Even God pays attention to me. The pain becomes a stage. The faith becomes performance. And behind the scenes, narcissism disguised as enlightenment. This is not a condemnation. It's a warning and an invitation. Freud did not hate religion. He feared what the unconscious might do with religion. He feared that instead of surrendering the ego, we would use spiritual language to strengthen it. And once the ego learns to speak the language of faith, it becomes untouchable, and yet completely in control. So what do we do with this truth? Deny it? Bury it? Pretend our intentions are pure? Or do we dare look deeper into the terrifying mirror Freud held up to humanity, the one that says, even your worship can be about you? Here's where things get even darker. Some of the most anointed figures in religious movement, pastors, prophets, gurus, began as sincere seekers. But over time, as praise increased and followers grew, so did the ego. And because the language remained spiritual, the corruption remained hidden. In psychology, this is called spiritual bypass, using spirituality to avoid emotional work. But here, we're not just avoiding, we're manipulating. We're creating God in our image so that He validates everything we do and punishes everyone who opposes us. Now, imagine yourself in prayer again. Are you reaching out or simply reaching in? Are you surrendering or performing? These are uncomfortable questions. They're supposed to be. Freud's brilliance wasn't in giving easy answers. It was in asking the kind of questions that stripped you bare. And in the dark, silent spaces of those questions, when no one is watching, when no applause is given, that's when your soul is revealed. Not the one you show to others, but the one you hide even from yourself. And if this has made you feel exposed, stay with me, because in the next part, we will dive even deeper into how this narcissistic spirituality doesn't just impact your personal faith, but poisons your relationship, your community, and your very sense of reality. Because the ego doesn't want a relationship with God. It wants the illusion of one. And that illusion may be the most dangerous possession of all. Let's return to the silent scene we ended with. You, alone in prayer, reaching for something sacred. But what if that sacred presence you feel isn't God at all? What if it's the echo of your own need, cleverly dressed in religious language and ritual? This is not blasphemy. This is psychology, and it's far more disturbing than heresy. Because if your ego is wearing God's robes, then who really is in control of your spiritual life? This is the core of what Freud uncovered, not just in others, but in all of us. The human ego does not want to be saved. It wants to be worshipped. And if salvation becomes a tool for attention, admiration, or emotional power, then even the holiest acts can become performances staged by the self, for the self. Narcissistic spirituality doesn't always look grand or proud. Sometimes it looks humble, it looks devout, it looks like sacrifice. But behind the curtain, there's a transaction taking place. I'll look like I'm giving everything up, so that I can secretly keep control. Nowhere is this clearer than in human relationships. When someone has crafted a spiritual identity rooted in narcissism, their relationships are no longer about connection, they're about confirmation. You'll hear it in subtle phrases. God told me you're not right for my energy. Or, I don't let negative people into my sacred space. What sounds like boundaries is often just ego management, and what sounds like discernment is often just fear of criticism. Narcissistic spirituality uses others to reinforce the self-image. If someone praises you, they are sent by God. If someone questions you, they are being used by darkness. This binary mindset is incredibly seductive because it allows you to never be wrong. You are always the chosen, always the enlightened, always the victim or the hero, never the antagonist. But what if God is trying to speak through the people you ignore? What if the one you labeled toxic was actually holding up a mirror? Freud's theory of projection helps us see this clearly. When you refuse to face your own shadows, you begin to project them onto others. So the envy you deny in yourself, you see in someone else. The pride you won't confront becomes someone else's arrogance. And the narcissism you carry becomes the flaw you accuse others of. Spiritual narcissism thrives in projection because it lets you feel holy while refusing to be honest. Take, for example, someone who constantly talks about being attacked spiritually. Every disagreement becomes spiritual warfare. Every person who disagrees becomes a threat to their divine calling. But underneath this drama lies a more fragile truth. Their self-image is so dependent on spiritual superiority that any challenge feels like annihilation. They don't need protection from evil. They need protection from being exposed as ordinary. Freud would argue that this defense mechanism is rooted in early trauma. A child who felt unseen, unimportant, or powerless may grow into an adult who builds a grand spiritual identity to feel special. But if that identity is ever questioned, even gently, it feels like death. So they lash out, they cut ties, they label dissenters as demonic, and in doing so, they protect the illusion but destroy any real possibility of transformation. Because transformation is painful, it requires that you lose control, that you become small before something truly greater. Narcissism, on the other hand, will never allow that. It wants control dressed up as surrender. It wants obedience that still obeys you. It wants to say, "Thy will be done," while whispering, "as long as it aligns with my desire." And yet, and this is crucial, the person trapped in this pattern doesn't always know they're doing it. That's what makes it so dangerous. Freud knew that unconscious patterns can drive us more forcefully than our conscious choices. So someone might truly believe they're being led by God, when in fact, they're being led by fear, by trauma, by ego, all speaking in a holy voice. Let's bring this into a real-world example. Picture a spiritual leader who gains a following online. Their teachings are powerful, their presence magnetic, but slowly, their message shifts. Now, Every criticism is framed as persecution. Every boundary they set becomes a sign of divine favor. Anyone who leaves their circle is labeled ungrateful or spiritually immature. And worst of all, they begin to believe it. They don't see the cult forming, they just see themselves as finally being recognized. This is how spiritual narcissism becomes a virus, not only in one person, but across entire communities. And if you think you're immune, you're not. None of us are. Freud's genius was not in condemning faith, but in revealing how the unconscious can hijack it. And if we don't examine ourselves, if we don't sit in silence and ask, who am I really serving? We will keep praying, keep posting, keep preaching, and still be lost. So the question becomes, how do you tell the difference between true spiritual surrender and narcissistic control disguised as devotion? This is where we must go next, because the truth isn't found in your feelings, or your followers, or your confidence. It's found in what you can't control, in what humbles you, in what strips you down until there is nothing left to perform. That's where we're headed. And it might just be the most uncomfortable and liberating journey of your life. You're not supposed to realize it at first. That's the nature of the trap. Narcissistic spirituality doesn't announce itself with flashing lights. It slips in like a gentle thought, a quiet feeling that you are different, special, chosen, that your suffering has a deeper meaning than everyone else's, that your journey is more sacred, that your insight is more profound. It starts like a whisper. And then, one day, you're not praying to God. You're performing for a divine audience that exists only in your mind. You're not surrendering. You're scripting. You're not listening. You're auditioning. This slow erosion of authenticity is what makes narcissistic spirituality so difficult to detect. It masquerades as growth, but underneath the surface, something is hardening. A self-image so protected, so polished, that it can no longer be touched, questioned, or changed. And this is where Freud's concept of the ego becomes crucial. For Freud, the ego is not just our conscious self. It's the manager of our internal world. It balances instinct, morality, and reality. But when spirituality is hijacked by narcissism, the ego is no longer balancing. It's manipulating. It's editing every experience, every memory, every encounter to preserve the illusion. I am good. I am spiritual. I am right. This becomes even more insidious when applied to forgiveness, healing, or calling. How many people forgive someone only to talk endlessly about how much they've forgiven? Not to let go, but to appear spiritually superior. How many speak about their healing as if it's complete, just so they don't have to admit they're still bleeding? And how many claim a divine calling, not because they were chosen, but because they can't tolerate feeling ordinary? Let's go even deeper. Freud believed that unresolved traumas don't disappear. They disguise themselves. And nothing offers better costumes than religion. The need to be seen as righteous can cover shame. The desire to feel chosen can mask abandonment. The rush of being used by God can replace the ache of being unwanted. And none of it is conscious. That's the terrifying part. You don't know you're doing it. You think you're walking in the light, while your inner child, still wounded, is dragging the spotlight behind you. Take this case. A man who built an entire ministry around delivering others from evil. He traveled, he preaches, people flock to his events. Behind closed doors, he's addicted to control. He cuts off anyone who disagrees. He keeps his family in fear. He never rests, never reflects, because to stop would mean facing the truth. He's still at war, not with demons, but with himself. The pulpit became his armor, the gospel, his sword. But he's not fighting darkness outside. He's hiding the one inside. This is where Freud's notion of the return of the repressed hits hard. Whatever you push down, deny, or spiritualize, it doesn't die. It waits, and it returns in twisted, disguised form. That's why some of the most toxic behaviors come from those who seem the most on fire spiritually. They're not lying, they're not evil, they're unhealed. And their spirituality is being used as a wall instead of a doorway. Let's look at something even more intimate, the inner voice. Many people think they're hearing from God when they're actually hearing the voice of their internalized ego. It's not guidance, it's guilt. It's not prophecy, It's perfectionism. God told me I'm not doing enough. God said I need to be more holy. But ask yourself, is that voice gentle or is it cruel? Is it freeing or does it feel like a leash? Freud taught that our superego, our inner moral critic, can take on the voice of authority figures from our past. So a parent who shamed you becomes the God you now serve. And suddenly, your spirituality is nothing but a recreation of your childhood fear, wearing a divine mask. That's how deep this can go. You can build an entire spiritual life on the foundation of a wound. You can memorize verses, pray daily, preach powerfully, and still be driven by a fear of being worthless, invisible, unlovable. And unless you're willing to rip the mask off, unless you're brave enough to say, maybe this isn't God, maybe this is me needing God to look like someone who approves of me, you'll never be free. But what does freedom even mean in this context? It's not about rejecting faith. It's not about becoming anti-religious. It's about surrendering to something real, something that doesn't feed your ego, but dismantles it, that doesn't inflate you, but breaks you open, that doesn't make you feel powerful, but makes you feel human. There's a moment in every true spiritual journey where you stop trying to look holy and start becoming honest, where you stop seeking platforms and start seeking silence, where you stop asking God to fix others and start asking Him to reveal you to yourself. That's the moment the narcissistic spell begins to crack, and you realize, I haven't been walking with God. I've been walking with a version of God that keeps me safe from my own truth. And what if your real spiritual awakening won't come from another sermon, another fast, another retreat, but from the terrifying stillness where you finally stop pretending? What if healing won't come from casting things out, but from letting things in? Because the next part of this journey is the hardest. It's where we stop talking about narcissism and start recognizing it in our own pattern, choices, relationships. It's where the spotlight turns inward, where the masks fall, where even your best intentions are questioned, and where, finally, your soul has a chance to be seen, not by an audience, but by itself. So here we are, face to face with the mirror. No more theories, no more generalizations, no more pointing fingers at pastors, influencers, or spiritual leaders, because now, the only person under the microscope is you. This is the part we all try to avoid, the quiet, excruciating confrontation with the self. Not the version of you that the world sees, not the curated personality that posts verses, speaks calmly, and always knows what to say, but the raw, unfiltered, trembling self behind it all. The self that's still unsure, still broken, still hiding. Freud understood something that still terrifies the modern world, that most of what drives us is not conscious. You don't choose your ego's defense strategy. You don't decide to become spiritually narcissistic. It just happens, like a reflex. When your soul is starving, and your wounds are bleeding, and your past is too heavy to name, the ego steps in and offers you a quick solution. Perform holiness. Dress your pain in piety. Speak in divine language so no one dares to look beneath. But now, the mask is slipping. And what's underneath? Let's look at how this plays out in everyday life. You say you're serving people, but you secretly expect to be admired. You say you're walking in humility, but you can't handle being unseen. You say you're giving it all to God, but you panic when you don't get credit. These aren't accusations, they're invitations, because buried inside these contradictions is a truth most never dare to face. Your spiritual life may have been built more on survival than surrender. Here's a chilling example. A woman who constantly shares stories about how God speaks to her. Very specific, very powerful stories. And yet, if someone ever doubts her, disagrees with her, or even gently challenges her, she collapses, not outwardly. Outwardly, she rebukes, prays louder, intensifies the spiritual talk, but inwardly, she shatters. Why? Because her sense of worth isn't rooted in truth, it's rooted in the appearance of being spiritually connected. When that appearance is threatened, her identity crumbles. Freud would have called this a fragile ego masked by a grandiose self. And in spiritual environments, this dynamic gets reinforced. People applaud the dramatic testimony. the emotional prophecy, the public expression of faith. But no one sees the person alone at night, afraid that without the applause, without the affirmation, without the platform, they are nothing. So the cycle repeats, the performance continues, the soul stays hidden. And what's most terrifying is how easily others get drawn into this dynamic. In close relationships, the spiritually narcissistic person often demands roles from others. Be my audience, be my validation, be my mirror. If you reflect back their spiritual brilliance, you're accepted. If you challenge them to be more honest, more real, more vulnerable, you're rejected. Or worse, accused of not being aligned. This isn't spirituality. This is ego protection masquerading as discernment. Think about how you treat discomfort. Do you immediately declare spiritual warfare the moment someone upsets you? Do you label any inner tension as a lack of peace and then walk away, confident that the Holy Spirit told you to leave? Or do you sit with it? Do you ask hard questions? Do you consider, even for a moment, that the discomfort might be revealing something in you? This is the heart of transformation. Not casting blame outward, but turning inward. Not elevating the ego, but breaking it. Not speaking with certainty, but trembling in humility before the truth of who you really are, behind the gifts, behind the ministry, behind the image. That's where freedom starts. In the dark room where there are no followers, no likes, no titles, only the trembling sound of your soul asking, God, who am I without all of this? And the truth is, most of us are terrified of that room. We've built so much on being seen as strong, spiritual, anointed, that the thought of being stripped down feels like death. But what if that's exactly what's required? What if spiritual death, the death of performance, of self-worship, of unconscious manipulation, is the only way to experience real resurrection? Freud never claimed to be a theologian, but his psychological insight unveils something profoundly spiritual. The path to wholeness is not through more layers of identity, but through the courageous removal of them. You must risk losing the story you've told about yourself, the story that says, I am always right, I am always chosen, I am always misunderstood because I'm just too deep. That story has protected you, but it has also imprisoned you. So how do you break the cycle? Start by watching your reaction. When someone questions you, do you become defensive or curious? When no one notices your efforts, do you feel wounded or grounded? When your prayers go unanswered, do you become bitter? Or do you begin to ask whether what you're calling prayer was really just spiritual bargaining? This is brutal work, but it is sacred, because on the other side of that pain is a kind of clarity you've never known, a spirituality that doesn't need to be seen, a faith that doesn't need to be proven, a peace that doesn't require applause. And maybe, just maybe, the silence you've feared is actually the space where God has been waiting to meet the real you all along. In the next and final part, we will explore how to rebuild, not with the tools of performance, not with the bricks of ego, but with the raw, humble material of truth. We'll walk into the ruins and ask, what survives when the illusion dies? And what kind of faith can finally be born when you stop pretending? You've made it this far, through the mirror, through the pain, through the collapse of everything you once called spiritual identity. And now you're standing in the rubble. No mask, no platform, no divine persona to hide behind. Just you, raw, shaken, maybe even afraid. This is the place most people run from. But it's also the place where the real journey finally begins, because only now, in the silence left behind by the ego's downfall, can something true, something eternal, finally speak. But let's be honest, this part is not glamorous. There are no applause breaks for confession, no public recognition or inner honesty. When you start rebuilding from the truth, it's quiet, sometimes agonizingly so. You feel invisible, forgotten. And your old self, the one who needed to be admired, who fed off spiritual performance, will scream to come back. It will try to convince you that this new path, this narrow, honest, humbling path, is weakness, that you're losing your power, your influence, your voice. But don't listen. What you're losing is the illusion. What you're finding is your soul. Freud once said that being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. It's more than that. It's the very foundation of authentic spirituality. The ego uses God to avoid truth. The soul allows God to expose it. That shift is everything. It's the difference between praying to control outcomes and praying to be transformed, between using faith to prove something and using it to surrender everything. So how do you rebuild? Not by chasing a new identity, not by declaring yourself healed too soon. The rebuilding begins with learning how to be with yourself, without judgment, without noise, without the need to feel superior or special. Just presence, just honesty, just breath. It means sitting in the discomfort of not being needed, of not being celebrated. It means letting go of the addiction to being right, the need to be seen as deep, wise, or prophetic. It means sometimes praying without words, walking without answer, being okay with not being okay. Because only then does your spirituality stop orbiting around your wounds and start anchoring in something far greater than your self-concept. This is where curiosity becomes sacred. You begin to ask new questions. Not, why is God silent? But, what in me was drowning out his voice? Not, why don't they see my worth? But, why was my worth so tied to their approval? Not, why does this pain keep returning? But, what is this pain trying to teach me that I refuse to learn? And slowly, something shifts. You begin to recognize God in places you never did before. In silence, in weakness, in tears that don't need to be explained. You stop needing to look holy. You start becoming whole. You stop seeking signs and start paying attention. You stop fighting for your image and start allowing your heart to be reshaped, even when it hurts. You also start telling the truth, not just to others, but to yourself. You admit when you're scared, when you're jealous, when you're exhausted, and instead of spiritualizing it away, you bring it into the light. You let your darkness meet grace. You let your brokenness become the altar. And maybe most powerfully, you learn to love different, not to fix, not to impress them, not to be the spiritual guide who has all the answer, but to simply be with them, in their mess, in their silence, in their searching. Because you've learned to do the same for yourself, no longer needing to convert every interaction into a performance, no longer needing to be the rescuer, the revealer, the righteous one, just present, just real. The irony is, when you finally give up needing to be spiritual, that's when your spirit actually awakens. When you stop trying to sound like God, that's when you start hearing Him. When you no longer need to control what people think of you, that's when you can finally speak truth without fear. Freud would say that the unconscious, once made conscious, no longer controls us. And this is what you've been doing, dragging your spiritual unconscious into the light, naming it, facing it, dismantling it. And now, you're no longer a puppet of your past. You're no longer acting out childhood wounds through holy language. You're free, not perfect, but honest, not above it all, but grounded in what's real. And from this ground, a new kind of faith can grow. One that's not threatened by doubt, one that doesn't need performance, one that doesn't use God as a mirror, but sees God as the fire that consumes every false reflection. This is the slow miracle of unlearning, the sacred undoing of narcissism, the resurrection that follows the crucifixion of image. It is not fast, it is not popular, but it is real. And in a world drowning in ego dressed as faith, that might just be the most revolutionary thing of all. So don't rush to rebuild. Don't scramble for a new label or identity. Just stay here, in the quiet, in the rawness, in the awareness that what is most sacred is not your calling, your brand, or your voice, but your willingness to be honest before the God who sees through everything and loves you still. And maybe that's where real spirituality begins, not in being seen as holy, but in no longer needing to